welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. Today we're bringing you the second episode in a mini-series we started last week called The Black Thread, about Norway's complicated relationship with its identity as both a progressive leader and an oil state. This episode zooms in on a problem we've talked about a lot on Drilled, what we call Petroganda. This is a word that I came up with a few years ago to describe the fossil fuel industry's strategic, deliberate effort to sabotage climate action and to warp the information out there about both climate change and the possible solutions to it. This episode zooms in on what that looks like in Norway. This is Black Thread, Episode 2, Petroganda.
Welcome back to The Black Thread, a podcast unraveling Norway's complex relationship with prosperity, identity, and responsibility in a warming world. I'm Dickon, a climate communications expert based in Oslo, the Norwegian capital, tracing the black thread, oil, through Norway's culture and society. Last time, we heard how oil is more than just an industry in Norway. It's a cornerstone of identity, pride, and culture, woven deeply into the nation's story. We learned how this connection shapes the way Norwegians understand themselves and the world around them, creating a tension between climate awareness and their nature-loving identity on the one hand, and the nation's ongoing embrace of fossil fuels on the other. But that's only part of the story. A growing number of experts and commentators suggest that behind the scenes, a strategic effort to shape support for Norway's oil industry is at work, influencing culture, policies, and even the information the public receives or doesn't receive about the relationship between oil and climate change. In this episode, we'll explore these perspectives, hearing from those who study and observe the industry, as well as those working within it, about how the story of oil in Norway is told and who is shaping it. So, let's get into it, starting with some insight into the idea that oil interests are strategically targeting Norwegians with messaging intended to prolong the acceptability of continued fossil fuel extraction. Julia Forchhammer is co-founder of Klimakultur, a Norwegian non-profit focused on building knowledge and community around climate, nature, and justice. Julia uses the word Petroganda to describe the pervasive phenomenon of oil industry manipulation that she observes in Norway. I asked if she could explain the term.
I guess the observant listener will understand that Petroganda comes from the word propaganda, which is like a one-sided ideological advertising spread over a longer period of time, the purpose of which is to influence people and their attitudes and get them to do certain stuff. And Petroganda is the same thing, but with the fossil fuel industry as the center, and how Petroganda is deliberately manipulating people's thoughts, emotions, how they think about things, and especially how people think about energy, climate, the climate crisis, and potential solutions. Petroganda is a perfect word for Norway, especially because so much of the oil industry in Norway is state-owned, and so much of the advertising and PR and lobbying is aimed at very young children, both in schools, kindergartens, museums, sports, etc. So that's why we use the word Petroganda.
So, according to Julia, Petroganda is the fossil fuel industry's toolkit of public relations and strategic communication, all designed to shape how people see the industry and protect its interests, especially when it comes to climate change. Amy Westervelt from Drilled Media, who has been investigating this topic for over a decade, breaks Petroganda down into 5 key narratives. Number 1, energy security, the idea that the industry keeps us safe. 2, the economy versus the environment, where typically we have to choose one or the other. 3, emphasizing how essential oil is to daily life, that we basically can't live without it. 4, presenting the industry as part of the solution to the green transition. And 5, positioning oil companies as generous community benefactors. From my experience, once you're aware of these narratives, they tend to show up everywhere. And in this episode, we'll hear how each of them plays out in Norway. Let's hear from Julia Forchhammer again, who shares how she sees oil industry influence playing out in plain sight.
I'll give you a very current example for what is happening right now. And that's in the north of Norway. We have one of the biggest bike races globally. It's called the Arctic Race of Norway. Equinor is the main sponsor. Lots of the teams are also sponsored by oil companies. And today we see our Prime Minister, Jonas Gahr Støre, is there. You got Erna Solberg, who's the Conservatives leader, is there as well. So you got politics, you got oil. We call it a folkefest in Norwegian, which means a people's party, a fiesta of all the people living there. So it's everyone involved in it. And probably all the news stories around this is how much fun it is with this Arctic race. So that's Petroganda in action today.
Julia shares the common picture whereby oil interests, politics, and local engagement are intertwined with one another, and the way that local and national news outlets typically describe such scenes as exclusively positive and removed from the underlying context of climate change. As a result, she explains, the fossil fuel company logos that line the sides of the racetrack, or which adorn the outfits of the competitors, and even the Equinor-branded t-shirts being worn by children watching the event or taking part in adjacent activities, they're all casually accepted as part and parcel of another fun-packed day, courtesy of the oil industry. Reflecting on Drilled Media's Petroganda narratives, this all sounds like number 5. The fossil fuel industry being a generous community benefactor, a so-called great neighbour, funding valuable activities for communities all over Norway. But according to Julia, what we're seeing here is more than just sponsorship or community involvement. It's deliberate, strategic embedding of oil companies into everyday life, into culture, and even into childhood experiences. In this way, Julia contends that Equinor, the Norwegian state-owned oil giant, and its peers, they aren't just funding events. She argues that through these kinds of sponsorships, they're shaping the national story, building goodwill, and helping to normalize their presence as a natural and positive part of Norwegian society. As we discussed in the previous episode, there's a sense that none of these benefits, opportunities, or activities filling the social calendar would be possible without the financial backing of the oil industry. So, Norwegians may conclude that to put climate and the environment first at the cost of the growth of the oil industry may mean losing out on all these incredible goods for them and their children. This raises 2 more of Drilled Media's core Petroganda narratives, namely, number 3, oil being essential to daily life, and number 2, having to choose between the economy and the environment. Julia explained that this kind of sponsorship is totally normalized in Norway. Indeed, during the interviews for this series, I heard long lists of examples of oil industry advertising and outreach, from exciting animated ads aired on national television to big, bold campaigns in national newspapers and more. But Julia emphasized the extent to which the fossil fuel industry actively engages children, describing, for example, a coding camp for young girls, sponsored by Equinor, taking place at science centres located all across the country, where participants wear Equinor-branded apparel and are exposed to what she considers to be deceptive narratives. Another example was a popular competition for budding technologists.
I've seen the videos from these competitions, and very often it's school classes. They go to the science centers. The rooms are branded with Equinor logos. There's loud music, there's pyros, and you see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids in Equinor t-shirts having so much fun. I also seen the photo contracts the parents has to sign for their children who's participating in this. And the photo contract says, the sponsors of this competition has the rights to use image of your child for basically everything. So what you also see online is so many children branding Equinor, smiling, talking about how fun it was at this event, how many new friends they had. And so it's very, very powerful marketing.
Julia also described an ongoing programming course aimed at school classes visiting the Norwegian science centres, hosted in Equinor-sponsored coding rooms.
Quite a few of the Norwegian science centres has an Equinor coding room, and they are designed really fancy. And it's supposed to be Norway's coolest classroom. There's a lot of marketing for the Equinor slogan, Tomorrow's Heroes. The children are programming a computer game, and the premise for the game is you are an energy minister of Norway and you need more energy, because it's always the energy crisis, it's never the climate crisis. The children also learn that they have to program border controls because people from poorer countries will come to your country and try to steal your resources. half of Norwegian middle schools have taken this course. I think it's such a clear example of how it's just ingrained in the school system through the science centers, but also through the Directorate for Education in Norway, because Equinor and the government is often co-sponsoring these kind of events. So how should a school teacher or parents be skeptic when these things come through the schools and it comes through very, very credible actors in Norwegian society?
According to Julia, Petroganda and its narratives are so embedded in Norway that government ministries and directorates are often complicit in amplifying them. Meanwhile, in Stavanger on the west coast, a place you may remember from the previous episode has a deep connection to the offshore industry. There's even a petroleum museum. Funded by a combination of the government, the local administration, and the fossil fuel industry, it was opened by the King of Norway in an official ceremony in 1999. Some friends of mine recently shared that during their upbringings in Stavanger, they were taken on multiple class trips to the Petroleum Museum. It's known for having a huge colourful climbing frame designed to look like an oil rig.
So much fun for the kids.
To hammer her point home, Julia handed me a pastel pink children's t-shirt emblazoned with a big Equinor logo, explaining that children participating in oil-sponsored community events can be as young as 2 years old. Not unlike the oil industry info boards I described in the previous episode, loud and proud about their work, these kinds of objects and the conduct that they're associated with can be seen as baffling or even perverse by many. The concern is clear, that these are the very children who will inherit a world shaped by climate change, yet they're being targeted by an industry that is knowingly contributing to the detriment of that future. It raises difficult questions about influence, education, and the messages that children are being exposed to. But what do the oil companies themselves have to say about this kind of public engagement? What do they provide as the underlying rationale behind these actions? To learn more about the issue and hoping to find some answers to these questions, I reached out to Equinor, who kindly invited me to their offices in Oslo to speak to their Executive Vice President for Communications, Jannik Lindbakk. I asked Jannik about the scope, scale, and intent behind Equinor's activities in this area.
Historically, I think Statoil and later Equinor has had the ambition of supporting culture, sports, science to an increasing extent, also education, research. And the reason for that is really partly because there is an expectation for us to contribute, but also because we want to stimulate and to be a positive contributor to the areas where we sponsor. We've had, over a number of years, talent programs within football and also within cross-country skiing, because these are two really highly regarded sports in Norway, close to our national identity. We've been sponsoring technology camps and competitions. We've been sponsoring startup labs. There's a lot of sponsorships that is related to what we do as a company to position ourselves also in the labor markets, because we need to attract talent in due time that can come to the industry and to Equinor to work with the challenges that we have in developing our portfolio of energy resources. So it's about stimulating interest in what it takes to be an energy company and how people is the most critical input factor in developing the company and what they can bring by seeking education, entering into research, and so on. And we believe that that is equally important for the future in order to take us through the transition that we need. We see it as the best way we can use our sponsorships and where we both position the company, but also then accomplish something more than just attracting attention to us. It's also attracting attention to the drivers of the energy transition.
Jannik explained that Equinor spends around 70 million Norwegian kroner, about $7 million, each year on these kinds of sponsorships, and that he believed the company now achieved a 100% brand awareness in Norway. I asked how the company justifies this concerted effort to remain top of mind.
We're a commercial company, we're listed on the stock exchange, so we're supposed to compete for opportunities, which means that we need to position ourselves, and positioning comes with marketing and sponsorships and using the toolbox to attract attention to the company and what we represent.
So, according to Jannik, these activities are just a natural part of being an industrial player in a competitive market, building the brand, attracting talent, and galvanizing the company's role as a positive presence in Norwegian society. But through the kinds of engagements we've discussed, Julia believes companies like Equinor achieve much more, She suggests they strengthen their social license, gain political influence, and develop a soft public image, all of which could make it easier to defend their core business and resist calls for rapid change. At the same time, beyond the everywhere presence of fossil fuel industry players like Equinor in Norwegian public life and the positive associations they enjoy as a result, there's another important piece of the puzzle for us to consider, and that's the actual information that's being seeded through these practices, the storytelling that underpins the games, the exhibitions, and the experiences taking place. As we heard, Norway's science centres are a common meeting point for children and oil industry outreach. In fact, Klimakultur has committed considerable effort to highlighting Norway's science centres as hubs of so-called Petroganda. Julia describes the deception that she and her team perceive in the way these institutions communicate.
In Norway, we have 13 science centres for children. 12 of them cooperate and are sponsored by Equinor. But what is typical for a science centre is what is not there, the information that is lacking. Because in all the science centres I've been to, there's huge climate and environment exhibitions, but there's never any information about fossil fuels.
Despite the presence of large climate, environment, and nature displays, Julia explained to me how the role of fossil fuels tends to be left out entirely, describing installations that instead emphasize the individual responsibility we each have to help fight climate change. For example, fun exhibits about how it's cows farting and people who are flying or shopping too much that are the problem. According to Julia and others, these kinds of narratives are a strategic shift of the burden of climate action onto children and their families and away from the oil and gas industry, which, she emphasizes, is never discussed for its role in contributing to the crisis. This, she claims, reflects a widespread strategy that hides the true role of oil and gas in global climate change. From the classroom to the science museum, the sports field to the music festival and beyond, oil and gas companies and their stories about how the world works are an ever-present part of Norwegian public life.
You can have a whole lifetime in the arms of an oil company, or 2 or 3 or 4 in Norway. So there's a lot of different things happening, and it's really, really hard to keep track of it because it's so normalized. And I think people don't really understand how massive it is. It must be one of the reasons why so many of us who are talking about it and working with this issue, so many of us are not Norwegians. We are not raised in this system. We don't speak Equi-Norwegian, as I call it. We don't accept this playbook.
Perhaps this is the reason Equinor's efforts to target children abroad have been met with skepticism. This approach is normalized in Norway, but what might feel routine at home, educational programs, games, and campaigns aimed at young people, has been discussed elsewhere as being inappropriate or even manipulative. A striking example comes from the UK. Energy Town, a computer game funded by Equinor and aimed at children as young as 7, has sparked a heated public discussion. Critics accused it of promoting fossil fuels under the guise of education. A since-removed promotional page for Energy Town stated that the game, quote, aligns with our work to build future talent pipelines and secure permission to operate at a time of sensitivity around fossil fuels, end quote. So, by their own admission, this isn't education. It's lobbying the next generation to protect oil industry interests and shape public perception from a young age. Meanwhile, back in Norway, similar campaigns are thriving and even winning awards. Julia believes these activities are having a real impact on the career choices young people are making, explaining that petroleum education at the University of Stavanger is experiencing record-high applications, while renewable education programs see falling popularity. Not only is Equinor collecting awards for its outreach, though, as we discussed in the previous episode, it's also winning them for being an attractive employer. In a post on LinkedIn, one of Equinor's executives shared how he would stop complaining about Gen Z, as it was those aged 18 to 24 who were rating Equinor highest in the rankings. Could this be a sign that the oil industry's long-standing engagement with children is beginning to pay off? Julia and others believe so. To get some more perspective on how industry spokespeople think about this kind of public outreach, I sat down with Ann-Cathrine Våge, Climate Policy Manager at Offshore Norway, the organisation that represents companies operating on the Norwegian continental shelf. When asking about her thoughts on the exposure of children to fossil fuel narratives, she told me,
there's always a risk for misleading information. And in Offshore Norge, we do our best to avoid that. Of course, we focus on being constructive and fact-based, and we have a high awareness around our climate communication. So I think the industry has a particular responsibility for open and fact-based climate communication. And it's important that industry participates in the public debate. So we definitely need this dialogue around the climate issues and the solutions like we have now. I think it's important that we have a deep understanding of the complexity and also an understanding on the history of the oil and gas production and the current status for the need in the EU and UK. And by that, we can also set the priorities and the strategies. So I don't think hiding that we are producing oil and gas is a solution. I think rather we should be honest on what we do. And we should also teach our children the history and the facts here. So I don't agree we shouldn't talk about the oil and gas, but we should talk about it in the right way and also put it in the big picture to have good conversation on how to achieve the energy transition that we need.
And Catherine's response reflected two familiar narratives highlighted by Drilled Media's research on fossil fuel communications. The first, Petroganda narrative number 1, links Norway's oil and gas production to European energy security, extending the story beyond national borders and positioning it as a sort of noble pursuit. The other, Petroganda narrative number 4, frames fossil fuels as essential to the energy transition, suggesting continuity rather than replacement. Both are subtle, yet they shape how the public perceives both the industry's role and society's capacity to move away from oil and gas. Though, just like Yannick from Equinor, she emphasizes that the industry has a responsibility to communicate honestly about its role in climate change, to participate openly in the public debate, and to provide context on the history, current status, and global relevance of oil and gas. My own visit to a science center earlier this year in Bergen told a different story. The exhibits were interactive, immersive, and clearly designed to engage and inspire. But the underlying narrative was unmissable. One game, for instance, had players moving illuminated blocks into place to capture and store emissions from a futuristic-looking energy terminal. In another, visitors explored a virtual world of offshore wind turbines, substations, and support vessels, while off in the distance stood oil rigs. The oil was always there, beneath the fun and behind the renewables, but it was never centered and never questioned either. Just a constant backdrop to Norwegian life, and certainly never portrayed accurately with regards to its role in global climate change. Though discussions, debates, and dialogue may be happening, they're taking place without the full context. This, in essence, is what Julia and Klimakultur are highlighting: the subtle, normalized presence of fossil fuels in everyday experience, the silence around their role in the climate crisis, and the pressing need to unpack that. I asked Yannick about Equinor's role in shaping public perception of climate change in Norway, and whether he believed the company had ever been responsible for misleading people about the role of fossil fuels in driving the crisis.
I hope that the way we communicate and the way we use campaigns and the way we respond to media and meet audiences and participate in conferences and events is true to the genuine challenges that we face in the energy transition. That's what we aim for. We're striving to have a good balance and to play a constructive role. So I have always felt that we've been very honest about the dilemmas and been actively seeking to take part in the discussions and the debates around us as a company, but also bringing insight and knowledge into the debates about climate change and the role that we see fossil fuel play.
During our interview, I shared with Yannick how I felt that there were some important connections missing from the information and exhibitions on display at the Science Centre in Bergen. He seemed surprised at my suggestion that the true role of oil was being hidden.
So we're not a curator at the science centers where we are engaged. The ones that we are engaged is really where it's close to our offices and where we're present, so that there is an affiliation with our own employees and the centers, and that makes sense. It's something that we do really because we believe in the way the science centers can promote curiosity into energy. We're definitely not trying to market oil and gas or to portray fossil fuels in a favorable way. To the contrary, I would say we are engaged to promote understanding for the needs in the energy transition and the role that we see oil and gas play in that context. The science centers should absolutely feel free to curate their exhibitions in the way that they believe is right. And our support should come as a contribution to that, not something that leaves them limiting their own choices. And that's not why we're in it. We're in it really to genuinely inspire and motivate and create interest and curiosity for what it will take to develop the new energy sources and to reduce the presence of fossil fuel in the longer term. So my thinking is that it would be very counterproductive, both for the transition, but also for us as a company, if it appears that we're trying to shy away from the dilemmas that we're a part of.
Had it been the case that we were discussing just one or two slip-ups in the storytelling, or a clumsy infographic that failed to join the dots between oil and climate, it would be less of a conspicuous topic. But what Julia and others are pointing to is a culture of misrepresentation, what they refer to as a strategy of disinformation. And while Yannick talks a good and very compelling talk, the constellation of neglected details and outright untruths that our experts have pointed to across Equinor and other oil companies' channels, touchpoints, and collaborations seems problematic. Julia explains the core of the issue.
When the Norwegian oil companies are going into schools and are going into sports and working with the media and working with everyone, where do we learn how oil and climate is connected?
So, according to Julia and Klimakultur, there are few spaces in Norway where children, or anyone for that matter, can learn how oil and climate change are deeply intertwined. And this separation of oil and climate doesn't just show up in the public discourse. It shows up in politics too, where, our experts claim, it shapes the way Norway sees itself in relation to international obligations and how it thinks about responsible climate action. To explore this further, let's hear from Anne-Karen Sather, journalist, author, and project leader at the Norwegian Climate Foundation, Norway's green think tank.
Oil politics and climate politics, they have been discussed separately in Norway, like it's been two different planets. So that also influenced politicians in parliament and the parties, and then the public in general.
Anne-Karen explained that fossil fuels have been managed under the EU's emissions trading system, or ETS, which in simple terms limits how much industries can pollute. Companies need permits for their emissions, right? And if they want to emit more, they have to buy extra permits from within a limited supply, what's referred to as the carbon budget. This creates a financial incentive to cut emissions because reducing pollution can save money or even let cleaner companies profit by selling unused permits. So, although you can shuffle credits around between companies, ultimately there's a cap on how much can be emitted overall. Meanwhile, climate policy takes aim at domestic consumption, completely disregarding the exported emissions of Norway's biggest business. This setup offers some clues as to how the paradox of a climate-friendly oil nation could come to pass. To dig a little deeper, though, here's Bård Lahn from the Oil and Society Research Network at the University of Oslo, who explains more about this curious situation and how things have begun to change in recent years.
There's a lot of interest and a lot of questions about this when I meet colleagues in other countries, because from the outside it seems so far-fetched. First of all, it rests very strongly on this idea that you can draw a very sharp distinction between the demand for fossil fuels and the supply for fossil fuels. And there is this idea in Norwegian politics that climate policy should only deal with the demand for fossil fuels.
Let me quickly add here that by demand, Bård means domestic Norwegian demand.
And, in that area, we're doing quite well, right? We're doing lots of stuff to reduce the demand for fossil fuels. We're buying electric vehicles to replace our combustion engine vehicles. This is even how you can explain the logic of shutting down gas-fired power plants on the oil and gas platforms and then power oil and gas platforms with wind power and hydropower and, making that out to be a climate measure. And that's what you're supposed to do, according to this logic, in climate policy. And then the supply of fossil fuels is a completely different question. And so as long as there is a demand for fossil fuels out there, then we are going to keep supplying the product. And then, of course, the other logic is that Norwegian oil and gas is actually cleaner than the average oil and gas out there. So we're actually doing the world a favor by supplying them with cleaner oil and gas. So again, this relates to the strong distinction between supply and demand and the idea that we don't have to take any responsibility for the oil and gas that we export to other countries and the emissions that gives rise to.
So, according to our experts, efforts focused on reducing domestic Norwegian demand for fossil fuels target the likes of electric vehicles, boilers in homes, and clean energy on oil platforms, the stuff that Norway is really well known for. While the supply of fossil fuel continues as long as there's global demand for the product, justified by energy security and the idea that Norwegian oil and gas are relatively cleaner than the alternatives. This division has shaped political discussions and the way the public thinks about climate action, keeping oil and climate largely on two separate tracks.
Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, this worked really well. So Norway was actually able to discuss these things quite separately and show a green image to the world. But then, of course, this changed a lot with the introduction of the 2-degree target, the 1.5 target, and eventually the Paris Agreement, because when you have these new targets and you have a finite carbon budget and you know that we really cannot exceed this budget, this is how much we can emit before we have to stop altogether, then that casts oil and gas production in a very different light. And we're no longer able to separate those questions quite as neatly. And that has really caused a lot of tensions and difficulties for Norwegian politicians who were used to discussing these things separately. There are some very nice quotes from former Prime Minister Erna Solberg about this. She has been complaining very explicitly, actually in several election campaigns, that someone has mixed these things up, taken the climate issue and turned it into an oil issue, and that's all wrong, as if those things really don't have anything to do with each other, right? And you can kind of see this frustration in her that people are suddenly conflating these two things that we used to keep separate. So that has really been, I think, very consequential for the way that these things have been discussed in Norway, that this separation has really broken down, I think.
Our experts highlight that oil and climate have not only been dissociated in the storytelling, but also in the policy making. Despite rising temperatures, international commitments, and more knowledge about fossil fuels' impacts, commentators claim that political will is lacking. Meanwhile, they claim, industry communication works to maintain the status quo. Here's Ann-Kathrine Våge from offshore Norway expressing the emergent response to oil and climate being discussed together.
The problem is the emissions, not the oil and gas. By reducing the emissions linked to the production and use of the oil and gas, we are limiting the CO2 to the atmosphere, and still we can use the fossil fuel energies.
You hear the logic. Oil itself isn't the issue, only the emissions are. Yannick from Equinor expressed a similar idea when we spoke too. Essentially, that if we can electrify the oil rigs with renewable energy and capture all the CO2 from burning the product, then fossil fuels can just keep flowing without consequence. It's a line of thinking that puts a lot of faith in largely unproven technologies that are being touted as solutions by the oil and gas sector, and, true to one of the Petroganda narratives we discussed at the beginning of this episode, frames the industry as essential to the green transition. But that wasn't the only framing Ann-Kathrine applied. During our conversation, she also echoed another of Bård's observations, the idea that the real driver isn't Norway's production, but our collective demand for oil in everyday life. This is another of the core narratives of Petroganda identified by Drilled Media, shifting responsibility from producers onto consumers in order to justify continued extraction. And it's the underlying narrative of many of the exhibits in the science museums too.
So we are fulfilling the demand for energy for the people. That must be affordable energy. And then it's up to the politicians and regulators to put incentives for the renewables to be cheaper than the oil and gas. And we see that by higher and higher costs of emitting CO2.
Those higher costs of emitting CO2 are caused by the shrinking pool of permits from the European Emissions Trading System, or ETS, that we talked about earlier. As the number of unused permits falls, demand rises, along with their value. So the cost to pollute goes up. But let's get back to Ann-Kathrine.
In this picture, it's important for us to provide good information to the regulators so they are able to set the right incentives.
So, according to Anne-Catherine, the ball is very much in the hands of politicians, and politicians answer to the people. But if the people aren't being provided with the right information, as we've already heard, how can they hold politicians to account? How can they make the right choices when it comes to who to elect or which policies to champion? In the previous episode, we heard how Norwegians prioritize climate and the environment above many other key voting issues. So, surely the media is providing the necessary, fact-based information to help citizens make decisions that align with their values, right? Let's hear from Silja Ask Lundberg from Oil Change International to find out.
We don't see the effects of the industry happening or the effects to the environment. So that kind of makes it blind for us. Back in the early 90s and up until like the early 2000s, you had dedicated journalists that were following the oil and gas industry in Norway. Now you don't have that anymore. Also, the oil and gas industry itself has become very hard for people to get information out on what's actually happening. During this summer, you've had in VG how it's been for workers working on Melkøya in Hammerfest in the north of Norway on an LNG facility.
A quick note here that VG is the national news outlet and LNG stands for liquefied natural gas.
So they're exposing how workers are getting sick, how you've had like gas flow out and it hasn't been reported, people are still working, getting sick, and how Equinor has treated them. I think that there are a lot more of stories like that, but it's not getting reported because you don't have that tracking of the oil and gas industry in the same way that you used to have. Not that it was exceptional in the 90s, but you had more coverage of how the oil and gas industry were behaving. Now the narrative is so strong that the oil and gas industry has Norway's best interests at heart.
According to the European Broadcasting Union's 2023 report Climate Journalism That Works, effective climate journalism is that which shows what is at stake, who is responsible, what can be done about it, and finally, who is responsible for taking which type of action. As Silja explains, despite a culture of media freedom in Norway, with few informed voices posing questions and following stories up, what gets said, whether by the industry or indeed politicians, is often taken as truth. You might remember from the previous episode that culturally, Norwegians don't tend to say things unless they mean them. But mis- and disinformation not only relate to blatantly false claims, they also relate to instances where, as we've already noted of industry communications, facts and context are left out. Indeed, Andreas Bjelland Eriksen, Norway's Minister of Climate and the Environment, has actively been addressing climate disinformation both at home and abroad. Earlier this year at a seminar hosted by Cicero, Norway's leading climate research institute, he defined disinformation as the intentional spreading of false information about climate and climate policies to mislead the public, often for political or financial gain, or simply to cause harm. The striking thing, though, is that he didn't mention Norway's own oil and gas industry and the country's role as a major fossil fuel producer. They were completely absent from the discussion. Domestic sources of climate misinformation weren't even considered. This reflects a common pattern in Norwegian public discourse. The oil industry is kept largely off the table, while disinformation is blamed on foreign actors. According to Silja from Oil Change International, the way that Norway's oil industry is seen in comparison to fossil fuel companies elsewhere is noteworthy.
So in Norway, for example, it would never fly to talk about big oil. You have that in very many other countries, like in the US, in the UK, but you can't do that in Norway in the same way because the general public is like, what do you mean with big oil? Like Equinor, but we own Equinor. The narrative that has been built also protects the oil and gas industry in many ways. And I think that is like a huge blind spot for the Norwegian public. But at the same time, I mean, it's important also to not only paint this very bleak picture, but also to say that more and more of the Norwegian public are increasingly critical to the oil and gas industry and want new policies in place, but that the major, I would say, holdup is the big political parties like the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, so both sides of the aisle, that are very much just repeating the talking points that comes from the oil and gas industry and are the ones that are maybe most active in just maintaining status quo and not want to talk that much about the negative impacts of oil and gas.
In the previous episode, we learned about the benefits that politicians see in the oil money and their ability to generate support by offering prosperity to local and regional interests. And there is indeed a close relationship between state roles and oil business roles. Those with experience running the largest business operations in the country, the oil companies, are often tapped to take the reins on major boards and decisions. Julia Forchhammer offered some examples from the cultural sector, explaining how the Norwegian Ministry of Culture has been responsible for appointing people with extensive histories within oil and gas to the boards of Norway's major cultural institutions, and that this has had a direct impact on their appetite for oil sponsorship. For example, the leader of the board of Bergen International Festival is a former Minister of Oil, who also sits on the board of Norway's second largest oil company. The leader of the board of the new National Museum in Oslo also comes from oil and gas, previously with a role on the board of American oil company ConocoPhillips. Julia reflects on the issue that she sees here.
So how can cultural leaders in Norway kick out the oil sponsors, and how can they take a meaningful place in the discussion of the climate crisis and the Norwegian oil business when their boards are filled with oil executives placed there by the state? That's something you don't see in many Western countries. So state, oil, culture and arts, very, very closely connected in Norway.
We've already heard how the Directorate of Education incorporates oil interests into the nation's schooling, but the situation that Julia describes, whereby oil-friendly folks are installed in major boards and even government agencies, is another that we see all over Norwegian society. For example, the communications director at the Norwegian Arts Council comes from offshore Norway. And beyond the cultural sector, there's an oil executive on the ethics board of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, a former Shell employee serving as Director General for the Norwegian Offshore Directorate, and, as we discussed in the previous episode, even a politician who started his own oil company. The list goes on and on. In 2022, Oil Change International mapped the network of Norwegian oil interests and found that this relatively small number of companies and organizations is deeply woven into the country's business and political landscape. Around a quarter of the 100 most connected organizations was found to have strong ties to the fossil fuel industry. The analysis highlighted how oil and gas interests are linked to trade unions, business groups, and political parties. Yet while the oil companies are undeniably influential, author, journalist, and project leader at the Norwegian Climate Foundation, Anne Karen Sather, says the real power still rests with politicians who continue to support the industry despite knowing the environmental costs. In her book, The Best Intentions, she explored what went wrong with Norway's oil adventure and when it became toxic. Here's her reflection from the research process for the book.
My idea was that Equinor is sort of having a lot of power over Norwegian politicians. But that's just half the story, because in many ways the politicians want to go even further than Equinor. And it's not like Equinor is using the politicians. They want this money. It's so part of our economy. So they are competing, or local politicians, they say, we want the new land site to be in our city or in our region. And in the north, Hammerfest was a city that was sort of almost dead, and then it grew and prospered, and the local politicians love oil and gas there. And the majority in the parliament, they are pro further exploration. So it's not like the Equinor has all power. This is something that politicians, or at least the majority of politicians in Norway, actually wants.
In communication, my area of expertise, we often look at what shapes the way people make sense of information. I can't help but wonder if what these politicians are experiencing is motivated reasoning. It's a psychological process where desires, values, or interests influence how people process facts. Rather than evaluating information objectively, we tend to accept whatever aligns with our existing beliefs or goals and dismiss or rationalize away whatever challenges them. This bias protects our worldview or our self-interest, often leading to selective thinking and resistance to change, even in the face of strong evidence. In the context of climate and energy, motivated reasoning helps explain why some people or organizations downplay environmental concerns to preserve economic or political interests. it may also shed light on why many Norwegians instinctively defend the oil industry. It's not just about facts, but about deeply held identities, values, and economic ties. These are the kinds of forces we've seen at work throughout the series so far, helping explain why the oil industry maintains such a strong presence in local life and how its influence shapes perceptions of climate and energy. Let's hear from Julia Forchhammer one more time, who explains a term she coined, oil-splaining, to describe the common phenomenon of Norwegians defending the oil industry using talking points straight out of the industry playbook.
Every Norwegian knows how to oil-splain. So when I meet someone, it could be friends, it could be very nice people, they start oil-splaining, yeah, but Julie, remember what the oil has done for Norway. How many jobs, how much money, our oil is greener, how lucky is the world that we have Norwegian oil, it's better that we do it. And then I know I have to peel this onion layer by layer and say, yes, but this, yes, but this. But that happens in Norway. And people mean it really, really well. And I think, of course, it's difficult when you have family who is working in the oil business or people feel closely attached to it. And that's why I think we in Klimakultur are always saying that we don't want everybody to agree, but we need to have these conversations. We need to talk about it. And we also need people to understand why the oil industry is doing these things, why they're sponsoring so many local community activities all around the coastline.
We've traced the black thread through different parts of Norwegian life: education, culture, community, and politics. We've heard how the fossil fuel industry's presence shows up in sponsorships, public narratives, and everyday institutions, shaping how oil is understood and discussed, and, by their own admission, working to ensure social license at a time of increasing unpopularity. At the same time, we learned how such narratives bleed into the ways oil is governed, with policymakers treating oil and climate as largely separate issues, leading to a situation where measures to reduce domestic demand for fossil fuels are celebrated alongside continued production, even as temperatures rise, international condemnation increases, and research continually highlights their impact on the climate. Meanwhile, the likes of the Ministry of Culture and the Directorate of Education are actively involved in the proliferation of an oil-positive public life. What's more, our experts add that journalistic scrutiny has declined, leaving yet more gaps in the public debate, creating an environment where talking points from the industry, often repeated by politicians, go unchecked and unchallenged. Following the Black Thread highlights how economic, cultural, and political factors intersect in Norway, shaping perceptions of the nation's energy future and limiting its capacity for change in the here and now. Essentially, creating a self-reinforcing system that ensures oil extraction continues. Next time, we'll examine some of the logic that's used to justify these conditions, testing the stories against the facts and seeing what does and doesn't stand up to the reality. Thanks for listening, and catch you next time. The Black Thread is a collaboration between Communicating Climate Change and Klimakultur. It was written and narrated by Dickon Bonvikstone, produced and edited by Live Solid Schullerud, and the executive producer was Vigdis Bonvikstone. Artwork is by Anja Jamushkevich. For more information, see the show notes.